welcome to all of you. Welcome to those of you who are here with us in person and also to those watching from a distance. My name is Stephen White. I am the Executive Director of the Catholic Project at the Catholic University of America, just across the road from the shrine here. The Catholic Project, for those of you who might not know, is an initiative begun in response to the abuse crisis in the Church. Our mission at the Catholic Project is to address this and related challenges in the Church through academic programs, research, and public events like this one. You can find out more at our website, catholicproject.catholic.edu. But we're not here to talk about me. We're here to talk about Paulina Guzik. We are here to hear her speak about communications and Pope St. John Paul II. Before I introduce her properly, let me first give a special word of thanks to our host here this evening, the St. John Paul II National Shrine here in Northeast DC. It's a perfect venue for a presentation like this. Thank you especially to the Executive Director, Maxime Noget, and the staff and the Knights of Columbus. Now, for Paulina. Paulina Guzik is Associate Professor of Communications at the Pontifical University of John Paul II in Krakow, Poland. She holds a PhD from the University of Warsaw. For the last 6 months, she has been a colleague of mine at the Catholic Project at the Catholic University of America, where she's been a visiting researcher since August. She is also an accomplished author, a documentarian, a journalist, a television anchor, a wife, a mother, and many other things besides. To list all of her accomplishments would take too long. I would just add that she has also become a good friend, and I know that I speak not only for myself and my family, but also for Sarah Perla and President John Garvey when I say we are tremendously grateful for having had you with us these past months. Since Paulina's arrival at Catholic University, she has been examining the communication strategies employed by the Church in the United States in responding particularly to the abuse crisis. The Church in this country has had far more practice at this than anyone would ever hope, and we have slowly, over many decades, learned to do a better job than we once did. It's my hope that through Paulina's important work, the lessons learned here in the U.S., both from our successes and from our many failures, might help other local churches as they tackle the same issues. Church communications, whether the church is speaking to the faithful or speaking to the world, whether she is speaking about a crisis or speaking about anything else, church communications are always ultimately about the gospel, and so it matters greatly both what the church communicates and how she communicates it. No one, I would suggest, understood this better than Pope St. John Paul II. John Paul II was a master communicator and helped revolutionize communications in the Church, in particular Vatican communications, in ways that still matter tremendously more than 40 years after he was elected Bishop of Rome. So please join me in welcoming Paulina Guzik as she lays out for us the 10 Commandments of Communications according to St. John Paul II. Paulina.
Thank you, Stephen. For the whole semester here, I was complaining, and complaining is a natural virtue national virtue of Poles, that there's no winter in DC. And now I can only complain that the winter came and the pandemic wave came and that so little people could attend. But I am most grateful that a wonderful group of people could attend this event today. I'm most grateful to the Shrine of St. John Paul II to host the lecture, and I'm most grateful to the Catholic Project at the Catholic University of America, to Executive Director Stephen White, and to Sarah Perla for putting this lecture together, for organizing it in the times impossible for organizing events. I can see friendly faces here at the shrine, and I can see that, for instance, my parish pastor, Monsignor Smith, made it to the shrine to check whether Paulina Guzik is not talking any nonsense about John Paul II. But I'm actually very much terrified that Professor George Weigel is listening to us online. But to be completely serious, I'm very, very honored to have you all online and here at the shrine in person. When he was still Cardinal, Karol Wojtyła, someone asked him whether it's appropriate for the cardinal to ski. His answer was, it is inappropriate for the cardinal to ski badly. And that's the kind of communicator we're going to discuss today. Why this topic? Well, any time of academic project is born for me with a simple notion. necessity is the mother of invention. The church, both in my homeland Poland and around the globe, faces challenges. It's not only sexual abuse, the crisis, bad management. An institution as old and as conservative in its views always will face challenges, communications challenges. It will always have to defend its position in the time of modernity. We need professional communications. We also often look at saints, just like John Paul II, as ideal figures, referring to their spiritual life, looking for great quotes of them, great sound bites for us journalists. Less often, we look at their way of managing day-to-day life. And today, we need exactly that, looking at what he did on a daily basis, how he organized certain things in the Vatican, how he provided his vision. And of course, we know he was a visionary. He's a saint of the Catholic Church. But we need to put into practice today what he did. We need to do what he did 40 years ago, because clearly he had a vision of communications, and many things he did better than we do today. And it seems like we have a better knowledge of communications today, right? 40 years after. So let's start looking at communications the John Paul II way in order to learn and put his best practices into practice in the institutional church today. Let's start with making the truth accessible to people. Some bishops would happily close their communications offices. Many lay faithful think that it's just an invention of modernity, that it's not needed for the church, that the church should focus on prayer and religious life. Well, here is what John Paul II said. He wrote in May 1989 in the Message, pretty important year for my country, by the way, and the Message for World Communications Day, called Religion in the Mass Media. The Lord encourages us very directly and very simply to take the broader view in our witness and our communication. Do not be afraid. What you hear in whispers, proclaim from the housetops. It is vitally important to ensure that among these many messages the word of God is heard. To proclaim the faith from the housetops today means to speak Jesus' word in and through the dynamic world of communications. In 2001, when social media was just starting to emerge and John Paul II couldn't have the slightest idea what it will be in a couple of years, he wrote for the World Communications Day message, where once the media reported events, now events are often shaped to meet the requirements of the media. On one hand, and can blur the distinction between truth and illusion, but on the other, it can open up unprecedented opportunities for making the truth more widely accessible to many more people. The task of the church is to ensure that it is the latter that actually happens. And of course, John Paul II gave countless television interviews. He appeared at press conferences at Sala Stampa. He gave in-flight press conferences that, by the way, started in his pontificate, in his first apostolic trip to Mexico, and I'll be discussing that later. And he knew at the same time that the personality of the Pope, however brilliant he would be, is not sufficient to communicate the Vatican, to communicate what the Church has to say. He had a vision of communicating the Church's message, and he was not afraid to put it into practice. This courageous vision, driven from his many virtues and talents, we are going to discuss today. And of course, with the great personality of John Paul II that we all know and remember, it is important and vital to know that communicating is not a skill. It's a personal quality. In a documentary I directed, I Like to See the Sunrise, that I will quote often in this lecture, Valentina Alazraki a legendary Vaticanista, a wonderful colleague, and the most respected one certainly in the Vatican, who is covering the Vatican for 47 years, told me, I think John Paul was a great communicator because he was a true person and a true human being. There was a correlance between what he thought, what he did, and what he said. In John Paul II's communication, we saw what was his trademark, his personal integrity. He could not be the Pope, we know and admire, if not for countless meetings with the youth, right? If not the kayaking trips, if not the mountain trips. Without them, there wouldn't be any World Youth Day, for instance. There would be no revolutionary look at the role of woman in the church, if not the Holy Mother that he had and an amazing relationship that he had with her, and true, deep spiritual friendships with women like Dr. Wanda Pułtawska, for instance. It was also the suffering that marked his life that made the Pope understand the suffering of others. And now, what made him use his personal skills so well when he became a leader of the church? It was humility. What John Paul II represented is the following: that everyone in the position of authority is a man who bears responsibility for his community, not because of that authority, but because of the position of service that has been assigned to him. The Pope's virtues as a human being and a leader were based on respect for others and on the fact that he served, not ruled. He did not put himself above others just because he was wearing white and led the entire world church. Instead, he chose a hand-in-hand approach. Showing empathy and humility is not a sign of leaders' weakness. That's what John Paul II was showing us. God, let me be a servant of your servants, asked John Paul II during the Mass inaugurating his pontificate. Arturo Mari told me, of course, a legendary photographer of Pope John Paul II, told me that in South Korea, during the pilgrimage, John Paul II crossed out the entire plan of the diplomatic corps of the Vatican and Korea when he spent hours in the leprosery. He wanted to be with the sick in the hospital. He couldn't care less about the diplomatic protocol and that the whole political group was waiting for him outside this hospital. He wanted to stop by every single bed. And this is what made television images around the world, because history doesn't remember protocols. History remembers people. And what John Paul II told us is that the ultimate test of your greatness is the way you treat every human being. Now, I think I missed one quote from Pope Francis here in my presentation. Oh, here it is. John Paul II gave us an example of being close to his people, close to the great and close to the smallest. He came out first. That's what Pope Francis told us at the centenary of John Paul II, which, of course, reflects the integrity of empathy and leadership of John Paul II even more fully. Now, number 3 of the communications decalogue of John Paul II, the 10 commandments of his communications, is encounter is the key to communicate. Father Jarosław Kupczak, a Polish Dominican who many in the room know and admire, told me in my documentary, Wojtyła had an unusual desire to meet people, talk to them, have a dialogue, and listen. But this desire to encounter others was motivated by an even greater desire to seek the truth. Throughout his life, he looked for reflections of the truth in various encounters he had with people, events in history, and in the work of different people. In other words, as George Weigel put it in the same documentary, he had people in for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. So one of the young people said to me once, George Weigel recalls, we knew we were an experimental field for his ideas. That doesn't mean he was experimenting with them, because he was learning from them in a very strikingly unique way. George Weigel recalls, I don't think I've ever met anyone in my life who was as relentlessly curious about so many things as Karol Wojtyła. Now, many bishops, many CEOs, many people in power would say, well, I have people for lunch. I talk to them. Well, the question is, who do you invite? Whether it's the people whom you know what would tell you, or those from whom you can learn a new perspective. Rocco Buttiglione, who had countless meetings with John Paul II in the Apostolic Palace, recalls, when he was writing an important document, he would gather theologians, philosophers, sociologists, and economists who were experts in the different fields with which he was concerned and would spend time with them and listen to them. At the end of these gatherings, he would conclude the discussion with a very few pointed words filled with humor. John Paul II also invited people who did not agree with him. He invited those who were far from the church. So let's try to translate this into the modern language, into the church today. How about inviting to the table the victims of sexual abuse in the church, people angry at the church? How about having the courage to listen to laity, to listen to mothers, and actually put into practice what those people advise you or what those people tell you are their concerns? How many youth ministers really dedicate time to be with their youth, to go on a kayaking trip, to go on a mountain trip like Karol Wojtyła did almost 100 years ago? How many CEOs talk to their employees that those employees can really express themselves, can tell the truth to their boss? What are their concerns? How many university presidents want to sit down with the students to discuss issues they disagree on? In other words, are we ready to sit down with people who are oftentimes younger than us, who are oftentimes less educated than ourselves, but people with the unique life experience that can bring something to our leadership? Now, for Karol Wojtyła, at those encounters, listening was more important than speaking. Danuta Rybicka, one of my favorite people on the planet and a member of Środowisko, she was, by the way, one that that invented the name wujek, the uncle. So the youth would call Karol Wojtyła wujek at the trips because they would like to hide from the Secret Service, who was constantly watching them and listening to them. And they didn't want them to know that he is a priest traveling with the youth in the worst of Stalinism in Poland. So she told me once that they would be afraid that wujek wouldn't meet with them anymore when he became a bishop. Not because he didn't want, of course he would want that, but because he wouldn't have time. Not only he met with them when he became a bishop, he even organized balls, parties for their little children when he was in the bishop's palace in Krakow. When he became a pope, the first letter he wrote to them, he ensured them that he is still wujek for them and they can still call him that. So when he was with his young people, he was really listening. And I think that Danuta Rybicka is the best person to tell you what are the fruits of this listening. So let's listen to Mrs. Rybicka now.
A jak chcecie wiedzieć, skąd papież miał wiadomość o małżeństwie, to właśnie z rozmów, z takich rozmów, z przygotowania takiego, nie tylko z ambony i zaliczyć podpisem, tylko jak poznać człowieka. Mój mąż lubił bardzo opowiadać dowcipy i bawić towarzystwo, natomiast był zamknięty w sobie, zawsze. Więc on poszedł do wujka i po rozmowie okazuje się, temat był poważny, temat życiowy, bo ma zawód, ma pracę i trzeba założyć rodzinę. Przyszedł czas. A wujek wysłuchał i napisał, i to widać nieraz, bo nie jeden jest list, ręcznie pisany przez kilka dni, bo na marginesie jest data. Wujek osobisty problem przetwarzał w odpowiedzi na problem ogólny. Także to nie wiadomo, czy to dotyczy Józia i Krysi, czy kobiet i mężczyzn. Czy małżeństwo może być tylko pewnego rodzaju unormowaniem pociągu seksualnego, który łączy się z uczuciami oraz z pewnym rozumowym planem życia? Czy też może być miłością zrodzoną przede wszystkim z rozumnego, duchowego wyboru? W większości wypadków miłość zaczyna się od mocnego upodobania fizycznego, które wiąże się z uczuciem dla osoby i domaga się racjonalnego rozwiązania przez małżeństwo w skali całego życia. O tych listach męża nie wiedziałam. Mąż mi powiedział już, byliśmy chyba na 50-lecie małżeństwa. Ja mam tutaj takie listy od wujka i one są tu i tu, ale ja ci ich nie pokazywałam. Przeczytaj je po mojej śmierci. Ja tak powiem ci szczerze, jak mi mąż tak powiedział, że to dopiero po śmierci mam przeczytać, to sobie pomyślałam, wytrzymałam do teraz bez tego, to i dotrzymam dalej. Ale po śmierci męża, jak porządkowałam tam różne dokumenty, trafiłam na te listy, to zaczęłam czytać, a ja myślałam, to mi coś takie znane, skąd ja to znam, jak to, tego takie ujęcia, to... No ale potem doszłam na myśl, no to przecież to jest szkic do miłość i odpowiedzialność. I od tego czasu wszystkim znajomym, zwłaszcza młodym księżom mówiłam, jak wam ktoś mówi, że nic nie wiecie o małżeństwie, to się najpierw zastanówcie, czy rzeczywiście przypadkiem tak nie jest, bo was to nie interesuje.
So the fruits of the exchange that John Paul II, Karol Wojtyła, had with young engineers such as Stanisław Rybicki, Jerzy Ciesielski was pretty big. It was a pretty fruitful idea because it led to the creation of theology of the body that helped thousands of marriages around the world and became the first apostolic retreat during his Wednesday audiences as Pope John Paul II. So it's a pretty successful outcome of listening to young people that were younger, less educated, but it bared very much of a fruit. Now, in the first part of this lecture, we discussed the many personal virtues of Karol Wojtyła, his personal qualities that led him to be a great communicator. However, John Paul II, as I already mentioned, realized that his personal skills are not enough to be a good communicator of the whole entire universal church. However brilliant, the church cannot be communicated if the communications is not professionalized. It was 1984, and CNN was already operating for 4 years, and John Paul II saw that no one really controls what is said about the Vatican. No one really can tell him how the world comments on the Pope. So what he did, he used his tactics. So he used his tactics of encounter, and he extended the invitation to the legendary journalist of Italy named Alberto Michelini. He was a journalist of Telegiornale, the most important newscast of Rai at the time. And Alberto Michelini told the Holy Father he would be bringing a friend with him to the Vatican, to the lunch with the Pope. The friend was Joaquin Navarro Valls. It was a Spanish layman, a numerary of Opus Dei, and one of the most respected journalists in Rome, the head of Stampa Estera, the foreign association for journalists accredited in Rome for the correspondence. And of course, things happened very quickly when an idea popped into the mind of John Paul II. So on the day that changed his life forever, Joaquin Navarro Valls was running a press conference with the most wealthy and impactful man in the business world of Italy, Gianni Agnelli, the head of Fiat, the motor company. So he's running a very important press conference. The crowd of journalists is there, and a friend of him passes him a note. Of course, it was not a time of cell phones. So the note says, John Paul II invites you for lunch at 1:30. It is 12:30, and he's far from the Vatican. So Joaquin thinks that a colleague just made him an unpleasant joke. So he passes a note back to him asking, are you serious? So a friend passes a note back to him, yes, I'm serious. The Pope invites you for 1:30 and you have to be in the Apostolic Palace. So Joaquin Navarro Valls, as brilliant as he was, told Gianni Agnelli and the journalists that were there in the room of Stampa Estera, what Mr. Agnelli is saying is so important that we need to meet with him again. Thank you for the press conference. This is over. And we all go. He rushed to the taxi and barely made it to the 1:30 lunch in the Apostolic Palace. At the table to effectively communicate, Navarro Valls answered boldly and honestly. The Vatican doesn't need any reform to communicate. The Vatican needs a revolution. As Valentina Ardraki recalls in a brilliant book, El Portavoz, commemorating the great Joaquin Navarro Valls, that is a source of endless stories about Joaquin Navarro Valls, including the stories at my lecture. So she recalls that what Navarro told her later is, this is what he told the Pope. The information coming from the Vatican has to no longer be considered as that of a merely religious source, relevant only to the Catholic world, but that the Vatican had to be considered as one of the main world institutions. The figure of the Pope had to be a priority point of reference on the world stage. He also told him that in order to achieve this, the information structures of the Holy See had to be modernized. Now, the Pope understood and accepted what Navarro told him, that people had the right to be informed and that the Vatican had to respect that right. John Paul II, of course, not only listened to Navarro, but took action, as John Paul II usually did after those meetings, and he offered Joaquin Navarro Valls a job of a Vatican spokesperson. And he was a trusted spokesperson. A few days after the lunch with the Pope, Italian Cardinal Agostino Casaroli, Secretary of State of the Vatican, asked Navarro to come and see him. He offered him the offer from the Pope to be a spokesperson, and he told him, think about it, but remember that if you do not accept, it will be the first time that someone answers negatively to the request of the Pope. Navarro didn't sleep the whole night. He was a psychiatrist by training, and he was a journalist. That was his job. He loved his job. That was his real vocation. I mean, as a new Opus Dei numerary job was his life and his service to the people and to God. So in order not to spend another sleepless night, he decided to call Don Stanislaw Dziwisz, the personal secretary of the Pope, and to give him one condition. That condition was, I want to have a direct access to my boss, to the Pope, which was, of course, a pretty unprecedented move for a layperson to ask the Pope. A day later, he received an answer. If this is what you wish, Mr. Navarro, the Holy Father agrees to your condition. That's how a professional relationship and true friendship started between Joaquin Navarro Valls and Pope John Paul II. Navarro Valls could pop up in the Apostolic Palace for breakfast, for lunch, for a conversation with the Pope, and he developed a mutual respect and trust with his boss, the Pope. He was the one that John Paul II listened to. But most importantly, and this is something definitely to learn in the relationship between the boss, for instance, the bishop, and his spokesperson, that John Paul II told him everything and left it for the decision of Navarro what would go to the public. That means he really trusted him. Navarro Valls was a very trusted spokesperson, and there was a layman director of the Sala Stampa before, but Navarro was the first one in the history of the Vatican who was both director of the press office and the spokesperson, which gave him an unprecedented authority and freed Sala Stampa from the powerful palm of the Secretariat of State, previously controlling all news coming out of the office. Valentina Alazraki, a legendary journalist and a friend of Navarro Valls, writes, I have also covered the entire pontificate of Benedict XVI and now that of Pope Francis. After so many years, I am even more convinced of the importance of the spokesman having the full confidence of the Pope and having access to him without any filters. Journalists loved Navarro. He became friend of many. He was a very talented person. He spoke Italian, Spanish, English, and French. And Valentina Alazraki again recalls, we knew while we were speaking with Navarro that before answering our questions, he had met with John Paul II and that he really knew what the Pope wanted him to say. This is a kind of spokesperson that the Church needs today, and a relationship between the boss and the spokesperson. Now, number 7 of our 10 commandments is never leave questions unanswered. When the 15th anniversary of the pontificate was approaching, Italian television station Rai asked the Pope for an interview with a legendary journalist, Vittorio Messori. They sent a handful of questions, and they were not easy questions to answer. Pretty much all of them were quite uncomfortable for the Holy Father to answer. But the Pope agreed to the 2-hour interview with Rai. He accepted the interview, and he asked Joaquin Navarro Valls, of course, to fix it, to find the time slot in his calendar. Well, Navarro tried for many months to fix this interview, unsuccessfully. There was no free spot of 2 hours in the calendar of the Pope as busy as John Paul II. So Navarro had no option, and he had to cancel the interview, sadly, call the journalist and tell him that the interview is not possible. But before the call, Joaquin Navarro Valls went to the Apostolic Palace to inform the Pope that this interview, unfortunately, is not possible according to your calendar, Holy Father. And the Holy Father handed him a pile of notes, saying, little by little at night, I wrote answers to Mr. Messori's questions, so if you think it's worthy to do that, please pass them to Mr. Messori. What Navarro Valls did is he took this pile of notes and he drove to the picturesque region of northern Italy, to Lago di Garda, Lake Garda, which if any of you visited, it's gorgeous and most beautiful part of the world for me, except of Rome, of course. So he drove there to northern Italy to hand those notes to Mr. Messori. He handed them, and on the first page of those notes, the little note was written, crossing the threshold of hope. Mr. Messori published the written interview with the Pope in the book, of course, that became the most sold papal bestseller of all times. It was translated into 40 languages and sold in millions of copies. It was certainly worth to not to leave questions unanswered. Number 8. Something happened with the presentation. Number 8 of the 10 commandments of communications by John Paul II is transparency. One of the values that Joaquin Navarro Valls and John Paul II treated as sacred was exactly that, transparency. John Paul II always thought that being the successor of St. Peter was not a power but a service, so he acknowledged his duty to be transparent with his people, especially in times of struggle. It was July 12, 1992, when a crowd, as usual, gathered for the Angelus at St. Peter's Square. But John Paul II surprised everyone when he said, I would like to let you in on a secret. He told the crowd gathered that he would be entering the Gemelli Clinic to remove his tumor, that he had cancer. By the evening, people were lined at the Vatican to greet the Bishop of Rome, and as he was leaving the Vatican to go to the Gemelli Clinic. Many politicians and business leaders would never do a similar thing because they might think their power will be shaken, but not John Paul II. He wanted people to be with him He wanted the people to pray for him. He knew he needed those prayers, but he also firmly believed his people deserved to know what was happening with the Holy Father, especially in the times of trouble. The Pope knew he owed transparency and honesty to the people that cared for him, just like he cared for them. Sometimes bosses didn't do anything wrong, but are afraid to tell the truth because it might diminish their authority. Today, leaders of the church, business, politics, and social institutions often treat people entrusted to them as stereotypical lepers, from whom one should rather run away and certainly not tell them anything. The question is, where is non abbiate paura? Today, the fear of revealing the mistakes of the past, for instance, regarding sexual abuse in the church, has obscured the carex of what is really important, preaching the truth and proclaiming Christ. John Paul II even had a term for transparency. He wanted the church to be the glass house. The church strives and will strive more and more to be a glass house where everyone can see what is happening and how she fulfills her mission in fidelity to Christ and to the gospel message. John Paul II assumed, though, that the transparency relationship mutual. The church needs to be the glass house, an institution honest and visible to her people, and he expected the press to be authentic too. Navarro was, of course, the channel that was making it happen. Now, John Paul II was a brilliant pope who knew how to learn from his own mistakes. A few days after each and every one of his apostolic trips, he would invite those that organized the trip for a working lunch or dinner, of course, as he used to do. He wanted to know what went well and what could be improved, whether the message has been understood or not, and how the media has published about the trip. A longtime Vatican communications insider and, of course, the successor of Navarro Valls at the Sala Stampa, Father Federico Lombardi, recalls those meetings with gratitude. John Paul II was not interested in words like triumph, success, but he was keen in the true results of the trip and how to do better next time. He was asking for the advice how to be a better pope. And that's what he got, because he made everybody just speak their minds. And of course, for the Pope, like John Paul II, be not afraid is the first thing that comes into our minds when we think about him, but also in terms of communications. John Paul's first Secretary of State, Italian Cardinal Agostino Casaroli, famously said, quoted in El Portavoz by George Weigel, "We don't really care what they write as long as we can do what we want to do." Well, that's the context of the time. John Paul II started his papacy and started, among many, his reform of communications in the Vatican. Given the times he was starting it and successful implementation, all of the 9 points we discussed today can be wrapped up as be not afraid. But since John Paul II had a unique sense of humor and loved making jokes, let me finish my lecture with the be not afraid rule, closed in one of the funniest and one of the most revolutionary journalistic stories of a colleague we journalists most admire in the Vatican, and who was mentioned in this lecture many times, Valentina Alazraki. It was 1979. And John Paul II was preparing for his first trip to Mexico. So Valentina Alazraki, barely in her 20s at the time, was called by her boss from Mexico, and she was told, you have to make an interview with the Pope, or you're out of the Vatican. So she thought, I'm never going to do that. She had a sleepless night, just like Navarro had. And she thought, I'm not going to do it. The popes don't give interviews. What does he want from me, my boss? But she was young, and she had an idea, a crazy one. She hid behind plants next to Paul VI Hall in the Vatican with a huge Chara Mexican hat, along with her cameraman. And when Pope John Paul II left the room, along with his staff, she jumped out from her hiding, with the Charo hat in her hands, and approached John Paul II. By the time Valentina recalls, the cameraman was completely pale in his face. The first thing I saw, recalls Valentina, was the enraged face of Monsignor Jacques Martin, prefect of the pontifical household at the time, very accustomed to the style of Pope Paul VI, who with a French accent said, "How far have we come?" What was the reaction of the Pope? Well, from what Valentina described, the reaction of the Pope was similar to what we saw when the clowns entered the Apostolic Palace for the audience. His smile couldn't be wider. He accepted the hat from her, he gave her an interview, and the very next day, that same Valentina started on the plane what we call now the press conferences with the Pope in flight when he's going to a trip or coming back from a trip these days. So if something describes best John Paul II in terms of communications, is definitely be not afraid of journalists. Establishing a relationship with us takes a leader who is a human being, and honesty and humility always pay back in this relationship. And if I was to conclude this lecture with my favorite 3 of the 10 commandments, I would say this. Never leave questions unanswered. Troubling issues only pile up when silenced and explode with greater force later. Listen to others. You'll be wiser when you ask. It will help you think outside the box or a bubble you live in. Be transparent, especially in the times of struggle. If you want to be trusted, start showing trust yourself. And I started this lecture with a skiing quote by John Paul II. Let me rephrase it into a communications one. Is it appropriate for the church to communicate? It is inappropriate for the church to communicate badly. Let's not be afraid to put it into practice. Thank you. And in this occasion, I would like to extend my gratitude one more time to the Shrine of John Paul II, St. John Paul II here in Washington, D.C. The Shrine generously hosted us today. But since it's the final days of my stay here in the U.S., I would like to extend some more thanks, if you let me, to some institutions and individuals. I thank Professor George Weigel for believing in my research from day one, for his friendship and support throughout those months. My warmest thanks go to Stephen White, Executive Director of Catholic Project, and Sarah Perla, Communications Officer of the Academic Project, of the Catholic Project, for making DC my academic home, for your friendship, and for our laughs at our team meetings. I also extend my gratitude to Catholic University of America and President John Garvey. Without the institutional support, no foreign scholar would even be able to cross the U.S. border. Back in Poland, I'm most grateful to Archbishop Wojciech Polak, the Primate of Poland, who may be one of the few bishops who understand why on earth I came across the ocean to research communications of sexual abuse in the church. But with his help, tremendous help, I was able to come here, and his support is very much appreciated, as well as his teams, led by Father Piotr Studnicki. And no Pole on Polish salary would survive a month in America without scholarships. Therefore, I am most grateful for financial support to the Knights of Columbus, Catholic University of America and Catholic Project, USCCB's Office of Collection to Church in Central and Eastern Europe, the Renovabis Foundation of German Bishops' Conference, Aid to the Church in Need, and the Grabowiecki Fund. And if you let me, I would like to thank a few individuals. The great Kim Daniels of Georgetown University, Jennifer Healy and Deacon Bernie Noyadera at USCCB, Teresa Pitt Green, Greg Erlandson, Father Patrick Briscoe, and also my cousin Arthur Sandel and my dear friend Joanna Rousseau, without whom my life in the U.S. would be much more miserable. Last but not least, I would like to thank Monsignor Bartholomew Smith and Mr. Ted Awensif, and the whole St. Bernadette community for making me and my kids feel embraced and at home, both at school and at our American parish. All the people and places I will miss dearly. I remember you in my heart and my prayers, especially through the intersection of St. John Paul II, who clearly led me here with his best friend, Black Madonna of Częstochowa, hand in hand. Thank you. If there are any questions, I can answer them, certainly. Or we can just discuss, in the informal discussion.